Welcome to Missionary Roundtable with your host, Kale Horvath.
Welcome back to Missionary Roundtable. My name's Kale Horvath. I'm a pastor and missionary, and I'm your host. Excited to have you guys back again. This is the podcast where we discuss the Great Commission and international missions and everything around and surrounding the strategy that we can have and our practice and our life in regards to the Great Commission that the Lord has given us with reaching the nations for the gospel. And so I'm glad to have you guys back. This summer, we are continuing our conversation with pastors and missionaries about the Great Commission. And today I'm excited to have on again, for the second time, my friend and pastor, Jeff Bartell.
Hey, how you doing?
Hey, man, great to have you. Jeff was on the very first season of Missionary Roundtable. If you haven't listened to the first season, you need to go do that after you listen to this one. Jeff was actually in the very first episode, so you can go back and find season 1, episode 1. The episode was called Preparing for the Field, and Jeff did a great job of just laying out it was 10 or 15 practical things you can do if you want to be a missionary, things you can do right now to start preparing your life for the field. It was a great episode. Pastor Jeff was a missionary to Albania for 14 years. He was, I'll say that, we'll get to that in a minute, the former senior pastor of First Baptist Church. That probably sounds weird to you, Jeff.
It really does. I was the former senior pastor. Well, okay, we'll clarify. Go ahead.
He's recently transitioned to a new role at First Baptist. So he didn't leave First Baptist Church. Would you like to elaborate on that? Is that okay?
Well, while we're here, I mean, it's not that big a deal. But again, thanks for having me. This is a lot of fun. But
absolutely.
So 14 years church planting missionary in Albania, 12 and a half years senior pastor here at First Baptist in New Philadelphia, Ohio. And just last month, made the transition, handing over the leadership senior pastor position to Troy Stogsdill, who was our executive pastor and very, very capable to take the lead of this church now, because we together for years have prayerfully considered when the timing and opportunity might be right for me to be able to step aside from that role so I could dedicate more time specifically and solely towards missions and education, Christian education. So my new role is specifically being the missions pastor. We have a lot of missionary endeavors that we're involved in, having recently sent you, Kale, obviously to Hungary. We've recently started a church in central Ohio. We've got a lot of other guys about ready to finish our Bible Institute. That requires a lot of time. So dedicate more time to the training and sending of families to start new works in new places. That's my new job title. I'm just barely getting started now.
So how do you what's the title? Associate pastor of missions and Bible college.
Pastor of missions and education.
And I guess maybe it gives you a little bit more time to do your other favorite job as the host of Theology Roundtable, the very prominent and popular podcast.
It is.
Which is a spin-off.
It's oddly popular. Yeah. It's oddly popular.
Yeah, in a niche.
We never anticipated.
Yeah, in a niche conservative theological audience way, it's actually a popular podcast. Praise the Lord.
Yeah, so we've been going 2 years.
Yeah, that's crazy.
At the end of the first year, we had roughly 50,000 downloads, and thought that was just amazing. At the end of the second year, we're totaled. We just passed the 150,000 downloads. So year 2 doubled download numbers over year 1. And, all 50 states have had at least one download, and 50 plus countries around the world. And we get regular listener mail saying that they're interested or disagree sometimes with things that we talk about, but we have a lot of fun, and it has been a lot of fun to do that, and never anticipated the widespread listenership that we have.
Yeah, no, I don't think, I don't know what we anticipated going into it, but I just always knew that so I don't know if I've ever said this on this podcast, but I knew that it would be a good idea to do something like that, because when when I was younger and in the college age ministry, probably 20 or 21, when Jeff would have, I'm talking to the audience now. That's why I called you Jeff.
Got it.
I'm not talking to the third person. In Hungary here, if you're going to be very polite and formal, you actually speak to them. We have a formal version where you actually just speak in the third person to them, which is very strange. So if you want to be polite, you talk to someone as if they're not there. There's a random tidbit about Hungarian. So you just, Jeff. But when I was younger and Jeff would have a guest preacher or missionary into the church, he would have them over on Sunday night to his house and just have them talk. And he would invite the college kids over and just listen and ask questions about missions or whatever those guys were into. And honestly, half of the fun of that was just being a fly on the wall of the conversation between you and whoever that guest was. And so kind of the idea was like, man, if we could fabricate that, into a podcast to where the audience,
that environment, yeah.
Right, was just a fly on the wall to listen to, you and Troy and Brett talk about theology. And that was kind of my idea with the missionary podcast thing too. So this is a spinoff of Theology Roundtable.
Yeah.
Was just have missionaries and pastors talk about the field in a candid way that maybe sometimes missionaries don't feel like they can be that candid because they're worried about support and whatnot. Sometimes, justifiably so sometimes. And so hopefully you guys have benefited through that listening to this. Today, I want to talk to Pastor Jeff, kind of springboarding from our first conversation in the last season when we talked about preparing for the field. You told a few stories about, you kind of landing on the field. But really, I want to talk about just how does one plant a church when they go to the field? And specifically in this context, foreign mission field, but, certainly there are domestic church plants as well. But let's just do it in story form, Jeff. When you first landed on the field, you were 30 years old. You had several years of training and experience at your church in ministry. You were single, and you landed in post-communistic Albania.
Right.
What was that like?
Well, it was crazy. Everything that had to do with the circumstances of my moving to Albania. 1992 was the year, and it was like December of 91 when the country first opened their borders, like the last of the Eastern Bloc European communist countries to open up to the West. Mm-hmm. Everything about the circumstances of me going permanently and landing in Albania as a bachelor in August of 92 goes against all the principles that we typically would set as parameters and filters and standards, for sending somebody out. Like, my situation was just very unique. And so, for example, I went on this trip for a 2-week mission trip just to see what God was doing with my pastor and a few other men in early July of 92. And while I was on my 2-week mission trip, felt like, this was the time God was calling me to stay there permanently. And my pastor was with me, so I did get to consult with him and share with him what I thought God was doing, and he agreed. But typically, as a pastor, I think if a young man is on a mission trip and his emotions are high and he's just caught up in the excitement of it all and says, God's called me to stay here, my typical response would be, yeah, no, sorry. We're going to go home and pray about it for a while. Those crazy 90s.
Yeah, you were 30. Yeah, okay, go ahead.
And I was not maybe my pastor's favorite guy in the church.
Get
let's
Bartell
just let him
out
go.
Of here.
We're going to have a win-win situation. We could send a missionary. We get Jeff gone. If it works, we get credit for it. If it bombs, we could kind of say we knew he was a loser anyway. No, I'm kind of kidding.
Kind of kidding, right?
But no, I mean, it really was a unique situation. And
Sure.
I felt like God was doing something. I actually had been preparing and praying for that for years, and he knew that.
Mm-hmm.
And I had finished the training available to me, and he knew that. And I just thought the timing was right, and he agreed. And so I went home. I was on my 2-week vacation from work. I was working at the time at a chemical plant as an engineer. Mm-hmm. And I went back and quit my job. And within about 4 or 5 weeks, I had sold whatever stuff I owned and was on my way back with a one-way ticket. And so here I am landing alone, something, again, you wouldn't typically do. You wouldn't send in a single individual without a family, without a mission board, without a mission team, without an existing national pastor or someone somewhere on the ground to receive him. I was what I've sometimes referred to as kind of the cash equivalent of, being helicopter dropped in the jungle. Like, here you go. I didn't speak the language. I didn't really know anything.
Arriving at the Tirana airport in the 1990s might have been like being helicopter dropped into a jungle.
Right. It was kind of crazy. And so without going into a lot of those details, it was super hard. And the country was very, very poor and there was very little available. Like, I can legitimately say, this is a great claim to fame for me. So everybody listening, you ready? I arrived in Albania before Coca-Cola.
Wow.
So,
there you go.
I dare you to find a place in the world that you can get to that Coca-Cola hadn't got to yet. So, for example, I arrived before Coca-Cola. When I first got there, really, it was just becoming quote unquote capitalistic and open. There's no real private enterprise. So There was still people waiting in line for bread and stuff.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So that was tough. And I lived in a children's orphanage for a short period of time. And then I rented a room from an Albanian family who didn't speak any English. And I was studying the language and stuff like that. And we'll get into the actual church planting stuff in a minute. But basically, a lot of these challenges were surrounded around just trying to survive by myself in a new environment, not being able to talk to anybody.
Sure. Well, and so all of that, all things considered, the emotions of just leaving, your family, your friends, your church, and going to a foreign field, not being able to understand anything, I can identify, oddly enough. Did you feel overwhelmed just with this idea that there's this giant nebulous amount of things that I need to accomplish, things that need to get done? Of course, not things that can be done immediately, but where do you start? Do you just feel overwhelmed with, should I start this or start on that? Or
it was ridiculously overwhelming. And so the interesting thing about the Albanian phenomena, if I'll call it that, the evangelism in early post-communist Albania, was that the people were so closed off to the rest of the world, they were actually very curious about anything that came from the outside world. Because I was one of the first, I would say this, I was among the first wave of foreigners to enter the country. Mm-hmm. So, just having a foreign-looking face drew attention and interest. And the Albanian people are very kind and hospitable and all that. And so literally just started immediately getting involved in ministry with a translator. And we maybe joked about this in the previous year's podcast. I don't remember. I've told this story a million times, but my translator ultimately became my wife. So this pretty young girl that was a college student translated for me. I hired her and ultimately married her. So anyway, she would go with me and we would, do ministry. And of course I would just be speaking English. We literally just went up and down these government owned, communist country, government owned apartment blocks and up and down the stairwells and knocking on doors and asking them, if we could share the gospel. I mean, I didn't even have to come up with some corny way to try and share the gospel because they were so curious about any foreigner finally showing up in their country. When one knocked on their door, they were so excited to see me. They were like, please come into my house and wait for a second. I'm going to call all my cousins first or whatever. And then I'd go sit in their house. And of course, they're super hospitable. They'd bring you, something to eat or drink or whatever, just a snack, a plate of fruit, a Coca-Cola. Well, not a Coca-Cola,
not a Coca-Cola,
but whatever they had. Yeah. Anyway, and then they would say, tell us something about the outside world.
Right.
And I would be like, well, that's very interesting because I actually came here to tell you something.
Yeah.
Whatever. And I'd share the gospel.
From the Lord. Right.
Yeah, literally. And so it was kind of it really was all about timing. But I just was in the right place at the right time. Now, in order to be at the right place at the right time in history for that country and that people, it meant that I had to have been willing to relocate under those extreme circumstances, alone, all that stuff.
Aligning yourself with the will of God and the plan of God in your life so that you would be sensitive to him moving you to where he was working.
Yeah. And so it was a very unusual. In fact, I'd say you're probably hard pressed to find another place like it in the world today. I mean, not like I'm an expert or anything, but to find a place where you could just walk in and there's just curiosity and hunger about anything new, and you can leverage that for the gospel, that definitely was in our advantage, those of us that arrived early on. You couldn't do that today in Albania.
Like, yeah, maybe this is an extreme example, but like if North Korea all of a sudden communism fell and opened up, like,
yeah,
would it have been that extreme feeling for the Albanians back then?
Yeah, in fact, that's actually a great example. I've always said, in fact, North Korea is one of the countries that I really pray for. I probably will never go. But North Korea would be the Asian mirror image counterpart of what Eastern European Albania used to be.
Wow.
During all those years of the Cold War and all that kind of stuff. And so as closed off as North Korea is, and whatever the audience has studied or knows anything about North Korea, it's a larger country. It's, it's a stronger military country and that stuff. But Albania is also a small country. But as closed as North Korea is how closed Albania was. And so the people on the inside of North Korea today probably have very similar, very limited contact with anybody on the outside, if at all. And so if and when that border ever opens, then the most logical missionary force would be South Korea.
Sure.
Right? Very Christianized nation who already understand the culture and language. They could just go in. So that's what I pray for. But that's actually a really good comparison. That's how Albania used to be.
What was it like, the spiritual state of Albania back then? Like, obviously, so we had your brother-in-law, Arion, on an episode this season. I don't know if it aired before or after this, but in this season of Missionary Roundtable, we have Arion, who's a native Albanian, and he speaks a little bit to this. But for you as an American going into that, just as an atheistic nation, what was that like?
So it was a very spiritually dark situation. And the people came out of a real atheism. Like they didn't believe anything. They were trained to be Darwinist, Marxists. And so anybody who considered themselves intellectual, you had to be an atheist. And if you tried to consider anything else, that was just considered a crutch and a weakness of mind. Yet, on the other hand, the younger generation, the college kids and whatnot, the high school kids, and that was the population, the demographic that was open to and interested in hearing the gospel, hearing something new. A little more progressive thinkers, younger, thinking about change, thinking about new things, not always just necessarily believing, what the older generation trained them all their lives or whatever.
Yeah.
So we found the good soil for the seed of the Word of God, mostly in the high school and college students, because they were interested in something new and something that, would have been from the outside world that might be different. And so, again, Albanians are very hospitable, so you could get an audience and people would politely listen. And some might even, like if you were the type of evangelist that pushed for a salvation prayer on the spot, I mean, you could get them to do it, but did they really understand?
Sure.
And I'm not trying to advocate for or against that method. I mean, let the Lord lead you. I'm just saying that there was a lot of people that prayed prayers with us that really never understood what they were doing. But there was a lot of people that did pray prayers with us after hearing the gospel just one time.
Wow.
That legitimately got saved, one of which is my wife.
Yeah.
She heard it once, she got saved. Some of the guys who are now pastors in Albania, they heard the gospel one time, they believed it, and they got saved. They didn't need to hear it 25 times. Yeah. I mean, it just depends. But because there was just a curiosity so in one hand, the advantage of this atheism was that they weren't ingrained in some existing religious tradition that was false. Like you didn't have to deprogram out, the false teachings of Catholicism or Eastern Orthodoxy or Islam or Buddhism or whatever it might be. They were a blank slate. And so dependent upon their individual will and willingness to consider eternal things. I know that for my wife, her story of salvation, she got saved the very first day on our little 2-week visit. She was translating for my pastor who shared the gospel with her on that very first day. And by virtue of the fact that she spoke English, and she was working for us, he shared the gospel with her and she received it. But her story, in a nutshell, basically goes like this, is that when she recognized that there was something available that was eternal and free, that she thought, well, eternal and free, those are really good. Like, I want that, I'm not turning that down. Like, I'm not going to have to be asked twice. I'm going for it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so there was a lot of people in that category. And so there was so much interest. It was real easy for me on one hand. Like I could tell my story. The circumstances of life were very difficult in those early years. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, the beginnings of ministry were very easy because if somebody rejected you, it was no problem because there was 10 more interested in hearing.
Wow.
You just moved on.
Mm-hmm.
And that there was so many people responding that then to try and assemble some schedule of follow-up and discipleship, well, that just kept me busy. This all started from a question you asked me, did I feel overwhelmed? Mm-hmm. Well, I felt overwhelmed because self-imposed problem here, but, I kind of felt myself as though I had the weight of the world on me, like all this nation of people, small little country, but still 3 million people or so. All this nation of people, like they're going to hell, and I need to get the gospel to them. And if I don't hurry and get the gospel to them, it's going to be too late. Like,
sure.
So I felt this pressure, and I had this open door, literally open doors, one after another in apartment complexes. I worked day and night and day and night and day and night. Wow. I'd go home to an apartment with a family that didn't speak a lick of English, and I kept trying to study and learn the language as I was going, and I'd go to bed every night with a headache and get up in the morning and do it again. And I'd walk everywhere. I didn't have a car at that time. And anyway,
they probably didn't have good public transportation yet either, huh?
Not really, no. So I did a lot of walking, lost a lot of weight. But at the time, I just worked myself to death. And after about 6 months of doing it, literally, I got sick, and I kind of collapsed from something. I don't know what it was. I typically just refer to it now. This is not a, legitimate medical diagnosis. It's just my recollection of what happened. But I just consider it like some kind of a severe chronic fatigue syndrome. Like I was just so fatigued. I could only walk like 20 yards at the most, and I'd have to sit down again and take a rest.
As a 30-year-old.
And I ultimately needed to take like 2 weeks. There was another missionary family that was doing some humanitarian work at an orphanage, and the wife was a nurse in the military. They took me into their house and just let me sleep on their couch and feed me soup for like 2 weeks.
Wow.
So I could recover. Mm-hmm. So, a lot of that was self-imposed and whatnot, but there was this huge open door. But I internalized it so much, and it was so overwhelming. Mm-hmm. I just wanted to go before it was too late. You know what I mean? And I probably should have paced myself a little better. I didn't really have anybody to coach me through that, so I was just doing what I could.
That's a really good. I'm glad you brought that up though, because so for me, it's different. It's not the same in that like you get here and then people are just swarming you, to hear the gospel. That would be an awesome problem. Right. I wish I had that. But just in a different way, just so, I have my family here, and then it's a difficult language, and then I'm trying to meet with people, and I just feel I burden myself, and I feel overwhelmed sometimes that I can't take time off. You know what I mean? Like I have to keep going because there's little old ladies in America giving their 2 mites so that I can be here to get the gospel to these Hungarians, and praise the Lord for that. I actually sincerely believe that. I do. But then sometimes I feel like, man, can I take time for me? And so how did you figure that out the hard way as far as how important rest was?
Well, it took way longer than it should have. And allow me to step into the role of your pastor now for a second and tell you that you really need to listen. The Old Testament principle of Sabbath is in there for a reason. You need to have regular rest times. And so you can legalistically play that out however you want to, weekly or whatever, but you have to have times of rest scheduled. And I imposed a lot of the pressure on myself, similar to what you're describing about my finances and whatnot. Like I refuse. So after 1 year of being in the country, Erin and I married and got our first apartment and whatnot. And like, I was such an idiot that like, I really resisted like buying nice stuff. I thought
back then or now?
Even back then. I mean, I'm doing better now, but back then, I'm like, man, I studied missiology, got to live like the people. The people are super poor. We're going to live super poor and all this kind of thing. And we needed stuff. And I was like, man, this is God's money. I mean, we can't be spending God's money on like a nice couch. I mean, you can't buy a nice couch. You could have a junky couch and still have a place to sit or whatever. I mean, it didn't matter what the detail was. So, and, not taking days off and not taking time off, it really did. It broke me. And, that 6-month period caused me to realize, look, to be fair, in Albania, there wasn't fun things to do. Like there wasn't recreation. The country was just suffering. Yeah. So there wasn't it's not like people had good jobs and they had their weekends off and they could go fishing. Sure. I mean, you just didn't have that stuff available. So, to rest just meant you're just not going to work today. You're just going to hang out.
So
you could go to the park. You could go to the park and you could sit by a lake or something and read or take a walk or just relax or something. Very few even restaurants to go to. Like literally it was a level of, third world development that it was almost unknown in the continent of Europe anyway. And anyway, so, ultimately I had to create a balance where I recognized that, and by the way, eventually this word got back to my pastors and stuff, and they rebuked me in love, saying, you're an idiot. Take care of your wife, take care of your family, do what you need to do, keep your,
buy things.
The idea is, I mean, the woodsman can't chop down as many trees if he doesn't take time to sharpen the axe. That story. So you've got to be able to do that. And
what was, I remember some stories about your first apartment that you made Erla live in. Wasn't there some detail about the commode and even your kitchen?
Kitchen, commode, the whole, shower, everything about it was, but again, it was fairly common depending on, again, these are apartments in, government subsidized housing. So there was various levels, of facilities, but a sit down ceramic toilet was not common in early Albania. They had what we called the Turkish toilet that you just squat over.
Wow.
And that was common and that was fine. I had to get used to it, but the Albanians were used to it. But that's what the house had. The shower, they really took a step up. This apartment had decided to install that fabricated a big aluminum box and attached it to the wall so that when the water was on for a couple hours a day, you could fill this big aluminum box on the wall with water, and it had an electric heater, like those things you could stick in, they used to have, you could plug in the wall and you stick in your coffee. It's like a little resistance coil, or whatever, and it would heat up something.
You just have a little
This was like
element.
A giant resistance coil. Like, don't be standing barefoot on water when you plug it in or something, but so it had this resistance coil and a wire coming out of it that you had to literally plug in a wall. And then, you just have to gauge when you thought the water was hot enough and then unplug it.
Yeah.
And then you could open up a valve and there would be a little shower head that would drip on your head real slow and you could kind of take a shower. If you left it on too long, it'd be scalding hot, whatever. There was no hot and cold mixed water of a boiler that, none of that stuff was available. And there was no kitchen indoors. So we had the balcony off of our apartment, little narrow balcony, had a sink, little single, like small bath, like what you would consider in like a small bathroom, single little sink. That's it. And it just had a spigot for cold water. That was it.
Wow.
But it had a couple of plugs out there. And so we had a little wooden table and a little tabletop, almost like a toaster oven. It was just like a tiny little oven and like 2 stove electric eyes on top.
Like a hot plate.
Well, yeah, like a hot plate kind of. And like that was it. It was just like a tiny little oven and a hot plate and a cold only tiny sink in the balcony. Albania does have winter.
Right.
So
right,
it was cold.
It
was kind of cold. Like, who's doing the dishes tonight, honey? That kind of thing.
So how did you find the balance between that extreme and the extreme of the missionaries who go to the field and live lavishly, like above, Americans even?
Well, I just knew that I wasn't going to do that. And it really was the result of what I still to this day consider to have been good training. I sat under guys like Jeff Adams and people like that had a good missionary experience, and they would talk about the negative impact to the ministry when Americans would go and set themselves up in these walled palaces, and they would have foreigners, the local nationals, serve them as servants. They'd have drivers, they'd have shoppers, they'd have translators, they'd have people pay their bills, they'd have people, because labor is so cheap and they have so much money and all this kind of stuff. And he just taught us why that was so detrimental to you getting involved in the lives and the daily, thing of the people. So I would never have allowed myself personally to make that kind of a choice for our ministry. We could go on for a long time about why those are negative things. I don't agree with that philosophy of living for any missionary. I also don't think you need to live as poor as I did. There's definitely a balance. You can definitely, because at some point, I finally realized that Albanians might have been poor, but that wasn't their choice. They were stuck in the country they were born in. That didn't mean that they were not intelligent. Highly intelligent people just didn't have opportunities that we had. So these highly intelligent people would view me as a rich Westerner, an American, moving to their country and living such a poor life. They viewed that like you're just a fool. Like, if I was you, I would live nicer than me. If I had the money you have, I would never live like this. Why would you live like this? You must be stupid.
Wow.
And so it finally dawned on me, I could live a little nicer and it won't damage the ministry. It'll actually enhance the fact that people will have respect for me. Like, well, of course he lives nicer. He's got it available. If I had it available, I'd live that way too.
And it would make your wife happy.
Yeah. And you just have a comfortable place to rest. I still never had like a 24-hour generator to kick in anytime the lights went out. When the lights went out, they went out at my house.
Yeah.
I was there for many, many years before we moved into a house that actually had water reserves, because for the years I lived in Albania, they never had 24-hour water running. Like, it was always on for so many hours and off for so many hours.
Yeah.
But you learn to live around that schedule, but that didn't mean that we couldn't at some point actually have nice furniture and an air conditioner or whatever, that kind of stuff. So,
yeah. So, okay. So where did you go from there then? You're in the country, you're meeting with people, you're sharing the gospel. Eventually you've got more than you can. How did you actually go about having your first church service and start discipling your first men?
Yeah, we did that right away. So because there was so much interest right away, we just said, because I was kind of working in conjunction with this humanitarian group that was working with these orphans. The orphanage that they were working at, the place I lived for a few weeks before I found that house, they had a big meeting room in the orphanage, and they let me use it for church.
So you started that almost immediately.
I started immediately. I just said, look, church on Sunday, come. And so I would preach and Erla would translate and come if they willed, And so
that was before you had zero knowledge of the language or anything. It's like, okay, I'm going to preach.
Oh, man,
she'll
nothing.
Translate it. And
Yeah, the
people are
whole
coming
thing.
though at that point.
Like crazy. Like it
Wow.
was crazy. Like I had more people attending church in the first year or two than in years after, because eventually people were like, the early time, there's just so much curiosity.
Yeah. Yeah.
We had like 200 people coming. Like it was crazy. And eventually that whittled down because a lot of those people were just coming to see the American or to hear English.
Sure.
Or to see if they could ask me if I could help them go to America or get a visa.
Right.
Or
So there was
whatever,
curiosity just about the outside world in general, and you were
just
the local
about a foreigner
American.
being in town.
Sure.
There was some foreigner in town and he's talking at this church. Let's go. Well, in the meantime, I'm preaching the gospel to him.
Of
and,
course.
all that kind of stuff. And so a lot of people did respond. And then I would schedule, follow-up times for discipleship with anybody who wanted it. And so there wasn't as many people who would want to be faithful to consistent discipleship. And we did a system very similar to what you and I are familiar with, obviously a systematic group of lessons, like 16 different lessons at the time that we used to go through a bunch of the fundamentals of the faith. And I would just sit down with them. So you mentioned Arion on the podcast. He was actually my first legitimate disciple. He was one of those guys, a young man, curious, that when his curiosity started out coming from atheism, he had some friends in high school that were starting to go to a Seventh-day Adventist church. And so Arion, back then, Albanians went to school 6 days a week and only had Sunday off.
Wow.
But the Seventh-day Adventists, of course, they got to take Saturday off because that's the Sabbath. That's the seventh day, So Arion, I think he kind of liked it just because he could also, for religious reasons, not go to school on Saturday. So I think he liked being able to take 2 days off. I'm not sure. But he was a smart kid, and he was learning some stuff. And then he met me, and we had a lot of Bible questions back and forth. And ultimately, the Lord got a hold of his heart and showed him that system wasn't right. And he legitimately got saved, and I started discipling him. Of course, he spoke English, his English was pretty good. He's much better now. But anyway, plenty good so that we could study together. And it was people like that. There became, it got to the point where, I would meet with anybody, but there wasn't a lot of people really interested in really dedicating themselves to study. So, I'd have 5 or 6 guys at any given time, and
that is
just
the hard
keep following
thing
up with them throughout the week.
Right, finding the guys who, because I've even noticed that since getting here in the short time we've been here, is you'll get people who are interested and they want to hear what you have to say, and then it's like, okay, well, do you want to study the Bible? Yeah, let's do that sometime. And then maybe even do that one time. And it's like, well, would you like to do this like every week? It's like, well, I'm pretty busy, I got school, so it is hard to find but that's what you're praying for, is those handful of guys that'll be sincere disciples.
Right. And the guys that really were getting it early in those early years, it's no surprise. Of course, we're talking back 30 years ago now. I mean, it was the early 90s.
Yeah.
And so, it's no surprise that those are the guys that today
They're the pastors.
are pastors of churches.
Yeah, sure.
Pastors and missionaries. You know what I mean? So,
That's awesome.
it just takes time. Ministry just takes time. So you invest in people like raising your kids. I mean, you're going to raise your kids until they're grown, and then, you're still going to be their parents and love them even after they're grown.
Yeah.
So, those guys got it. They got excited. Like I said, it was a unique time in history. It also was to our ministry strategy advantage that the country had nothing else to offer. Like, they weren't distracted like you're talking about the people that you might meet today. Like, there wasn't a lot of recreation. There wasn't a lot of financial stimulus offers or opportunities. They were either college students or wannabe college students. And, there was just a ton of free time with not much to do.
Wow.
And so we're like, hey, here's something new. And if they were even legitimately kind of interested, well, I might as well, let's go check it out. Let's go talk to the guy. Let's go learn some stuff. And if you give them something that was real spiritual food and interesting to them, they're like, well, let's do some more of this. So we had in the early years, I mean, there was some legitimate spiritual fire and hunger among the people. They were like reading through their Bibles every year, multiple times a year. They were challenging one another to do stuff like that and go witness to their friends and bring them to church. Like,
yeah, that's awesome.
It took time for the Western world's wealth to make it into Albania, to then distract the Christians away from the Lord.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? To make the world
that
more like it is that we understand.
Right. Because you're right. Living in like Budapest, 2 million people. There's so many things that you can go do. I
Right.
mean, it's just in some aspects, it's just like living in either Western Europe or an American city.
Right.
But
Yeah.
so that's really cool. So you start discipling guys. You're already meeting for church on Sundays. How long did it take you to feel like, you're an Albanian, you speak the language, like to a point to where you aren't laboring to understand and to speak, and you actually felt like you were a pastor of a church? You know what I mean? Like, how long did that take to kind of get everything settled and like, okay, we have this church. It's a fairly, not a mature church, but like we meet every Sunday. We have these things planned. I speak the language. I'm preaching in the language.
Yeah. Well, let me start with the church thing. I mean, so I did the work of a pastor from the very beginning. And so that just continued the entire time. I probably felt it, if you want to talk about feeling it. It probably took a year or two to really feel like, I'm the shepherd of this group of people that has now kind of whittled themselves down to those that are a little more serious.
Because it was an infantile church for a little while.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, all baby Christians. I mean, I was preaching and, systematically through simple things in the Gospels and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
And so, all that stuff just to reinforce, who Jesus is and what he came to do, and salvation and eternal security and just basic doctrines and simple things on how they can learn to study the Bible for themselves. And they didn't always need to just listen to me, because I really wanted to establish the authority of the scriptures in their life, because there was an ever-growing number of other religions and cults. I mean, it's not like I said, the Seventh-day Adventists and Jehovah's Witness and, of course, Catholics and Muslims and every other denomination and all these different, everybody had some representative somewhere preaching now.
Sure.
So, how are you going to keep the people from, why should they listen to me if the other guy's a more skilled orator?
Mm-hmm.
Well, they should only listen to me if I'm giving them the words of God. So they need to learn how to study that for themselves. Once they started getting into that, you started really feeling like a shepherd, kind of like their spiritual father.
Yeah.
And that was within the first year or two. And so for example, at the end of 1 year, I could get around town, I could shop, I could do my own stuff in the language, but I still wasn't that good. At the end of the second year, I could do a bunch of stuff in church. I could handle interaction and prayer requests and pray in Albanian, that kind of thing. But I wasn't preaching, because that's harder.
Yeah.
And then maybe by the third year, I was doing, so we did like Sundays and Wednesdays. So like I would then switch, the Wednesday night was more of a deeper Bible study. So less attended, but more serious students.
Okay.
So the Wednesday night Bible study, I started doing that in Albanian first, because I figured, they like me. They're into the Bible. They'll be more tolerant if I make mistakes. They're not here to just see Jeff. They're here to actually learn something. So let's get into the Word of God, and I'll do what I can.
Mm-hmm.
And if I make mistakes, some of them speak English, they'll correct me, and we'll just move on.
Yeah.
And it'll be okay. And it wasn't until about the third into the fourth year, probably by the third year, I was probably capable of handling it all on my own. But I still had, so by this time we're having our first baby. And so I kind of retired my wife from translation. Arione was translating. There were some other translators. Yeah. But by the fourth year, the circumstances worked out that the Lord had kind of saw fit to remove those people from our church. And like the people that spoke good enough English to really translate, left. They moved. They relocated. They went somewhere else.
Interesting.
And so, it was just the Lord reminded me, hey, look, you're ready. Why?
It's time.
Why are you relying on translators? That's stupid.
Yeah.
Just jump out and do it. And so for sure, by the fourth year, I was in full Albanian mode, and we really never had any other American missionary team, working with us. There was one family that lived and worked with us for a little while, for a number of years, but they were focused a little more on physical works and stuff like that. Anyway, my wife's Albanian. I had an unfair advantage, I say, as far as that goes. But we lived our lives like Albanians, among Albanians.
Sure.
I didn't hang out with what was now a growing expat missionary community. They weren't my friends. I didn't mean for them not to be my friends, but I just invested my life in the Albanians as my friends.
Sure.
So, 3-4 years in, like, I just considered myself one of them.
Yeah.
I knew I wasn't, but I considered myself one of them. But
that's cool.
They considered me one of them because they knew they knew that I'd given my life to do that. And obviously I married into the culture and I lived and did, that kind of stuff. So
on that language, in that same vein, I don't know if I've ever asked you this, but I just thought of this while you were talking about it. Was it when you started to preach in that 4th year or roundabout then that you started, when did you start reading the Bible in Albanian rather than your English Bible? I know that there's, historically with the Albanian Bible, there were some issues there. There wasn't one immediately. But when did you start, or did you ever abandon the English Bible as far as your devotions go? I'm curious.
Oh, yeah. I used to read the Albanian Bible regularly all the time. I will say, though, that when I was studying in detail for sermons, I would always study, my King James English Bible, just because I knew it was, 100% perfect.
Sure.
And I would study
Albanian
it,
Bible
but I
was
would
new,
always
a new translation. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I would always have the Albanian Bible open next to it. And just to make sure that it didn't have some gross error,
sure.
As I was going down the line. But I consistently read the Albanian Bible and just, worked actively on memorizing scripture in the Albanian Bible so that while you're preaching, the Lord just gives you a thought. You may not have had it in your notes.
Right.
You just want to quote something. Well, you want to quote it right.
Yeah.
You don't want to just make up some weird American
translation
in your head translation,
yeah,
or whatever.
Yeah.
And so,
wow,
I regularly would read and study along that line for that reason. But when it was like, I'm studying this doctrine to preach it, I never just singularly studied out of the Albanian Bible without my King James Bible.
But when you were just spending your devotional time in the morning or something, would you do that in the Albanian Bible eventually?
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely.
Wow. That's awesome. I can't wait till I can get to that point in the language, man. That seems impossible that you could interact with another language Bible in the way that you did with your heart language,
Well, it's really interesting, Kale, and you'll eventually get to this point, I'm sure, but you really can get to the point where your second language becomes your dominant language if you use it enough.
Wow.
And it can become so dominant that, maybe you've met people that have done this and it seemed hokey to you. But sometimes these will be like Americans, but they've spent so many years where they're at. Sometimes they'll fight to find the right English word. And they'll be like, how do you say that in English? Well, that's not because they're trying to look cool or whatever. It's truly because they spend more hours of the day thinking and acting
in the other language,
in the new language, in this other language, and they feel more comfortable doing it. Like people say, there's certain ways you can tell, you can measure certain things. Like, Jeff Adams used to teach us, the language is just the key to the culture. The goal isn't to learn the language. The goal is to learn the culture. But without the language, you can't get the culture.
Sure.
Well, the idea is the language just helps you understand. For example, Hungarians think the way they think, and I better understand it now because I can tell by the way they structure their sentences. I can tell by the way that they use these terms and phrases and these idioms and, these colloquial expressions and all that kind of stuff. When you get all that stuff down and you can use it right, then you start realizing, oh, this is how they think.
Yeah.
And so when I got to where I could use those kind of daily colloquial street type phraseology in the proper context, like the Albanians were just blown away. Like,
that's awesome.
Oh, you're one of us now.
Yeah.
But you just start thinking that way and you realize, oh, okay, everything you guys do isn't weird. It isn't wrong. It's just different.
Yeah.
And maybe I can kind of see why you think Americans are weird or whatever. It doesn't even matter. It's just your point of reference. And so that then becomes the joy, because then you're like, oh, the Lord can actually so the Albanian Bible wasn't a perfect translation, but it wasn't horrible. And you know what? Sometimes just the way that the Albanian language had certain words available in the vocabulary, well, it helped me to better understand principles I might not have got just in English. So, it was just fun. It became a lot of fun to be able to have that comfort level You know, people sometimes say, have you ever dreamed in Albanian?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I used to all the time. I don't anymore.
Sure.
But you just have a dream, and everything in the dream was in that language, and you're like, oh, because that's as natural as anything else. You know what I mean?
Someone asked me that the other day. Do you dream in Hungarian yet? And I said, well, yeah, but not the way you're thinking. I dream about not doing my homework or not understanding a word in language class. Oh, man.
Right.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, thanks,
Hang
Jeff.
in there, man.
Oh,
it'll come.
Yeah, thanks, man. I appreciate it. So this is good. I want to tie a bow on this. This has been awesome. But there's a question that's kind of out of left field for this conversation, but I've been trying to ask it to everyone I've had on the show this year. 2020 was a crazy year. COVID, the whole pandemic situation. I kind of already know a little bit of your answer to this question, but I want you to,
I'll see if I can throw you a curveball.
Yeah. How has the world events of the last year and going forward, if at all, how has it affected your urgency, strategy for the Great Commission, or even just your walk with God?
Oh yeah, you know my answer to this one for sure. Then, So
I've been getting some really good answers, though. It's been really good to hear from all over the world.
Episodes.
Yeah,
I'm sure that'll be fantastic. I actually am a very strong believer in what I consider to be the setting in place of the events of the end time, and so we believe in a pre-tribulation rapture and premillennial return to Jesus Christ and all that sort of stuff. Mm-hmm. Anybody who really understands the Bible, I think, would have to agree. I'll just say that out loud.
This is Theology Roundtable. Jeff's starting to come out now. Yeah,
I can't help it. Anyway, I actually believe that what the Bible does reveal, and when the Bible speaks prophetically, it speaks in generalities. So that's why, for centuries, people try and guess, and nobody guesses exactly right. Mm-hmm. And I could be accused of being just the next guesser who could be wrong. I get it. But I think there's certain timelines in the scripture, and I think those timelines point to a very near time, date, and coming of the Lord Jesus physically, which then you'd have to take away the tribulation prior to that.
Sure.
I think that certain strategies of how in the world is there going to be this great deception and ruling the whole, how could the man of sin step up and rule the whole world? What is the thing that would bring the whole world together in a one world socialist governmental structure? And so what I have observed is that, COVID, biological weaponry to place fear in the heart of man is, if not the ultimate strategy of the devil to set up the end, it sure is a really good test case. And if the devil wanted to use something to test how effectively could he control, not just Americans or not just a region of the world, but the entire global population with one sweeping event.
Yeah.
Well, COVID sure was a really good test case. Now I'll let the listeners decide, what you pick for yourself, whether you think that this was intentionally man-made and propagated as weaponry or whether it was naturally occurring and the devil just said, oh, that's handy, I think I'll use it, or whatever. Yeah. But whatever the case might be, I believe that we are in the very last days and the very last minutes. Mm-hmm. So therefore, all I seem to ever think about and all I seem to ever talk about and conclude messages that I preach about is we have to be about our Father's business. We have to. And I think it's the grace of God. Like, it's all about evangelism to me, like discipleship, of course. But man, we've got to get the last few guys in the boat before it's too late.
Amen.
And it could be too late any minute. And it could be too late between when we record this today and when you air it. I mean, who knows, right?
It could be
that
spring,
soon.
Right? Yeah.
And so, we've just got to run to the finish line. And I think it's going to get harder before it gets easier. I think that the pressure against the churches, against missions. Look, COVID made it almost impossible for anybody to travel internationally. You know how hard it was for you to get into Hungary, Europe especially. It's really hard to send traditional missionaries from the West to the rest of the world anymore and to get a missionary visa to go there. soon enough, I anticipate it'll be hard enough for us to send money internationally to support missions.
Could be, yeah.
And then all that's going to be left is just for the devil to come straight up and shut down churches. The governmental structures and all these executive orders and all these ways. I mean, there's just so much stuff going on that it's just a matter of time. Whenever the Lord allows and whenever the timing's right, the man of sin can pop up and establish, is the COVID vaccine the mark of the beast? Everybody likes to argue stuff like that. Well, no, it's not the mark of the beast. And so, if you get it or don't get it, according to your conscience, get it or don't get it. I don't care. It's not going to send you to hell if you're saved. You're fine. The point is, it's a good forerunner. It's a good example of the kind of a thing that the devil's getting the world ready for, that the whole world will sign up to take something in the fore of their head or their right hand.
Yeah.
That will be a mark that ultimately...
to do anything.
Right. And
which
and
we're already seeing,
so,
especially in Europe right now. There's, certificates that you have to provide.
Yeah, vaccination passports and all that kind of stuff.
It's happening.
Right. And so all this stuff is going on and really sets up the time of the end. For me, it sets up the urgency like, look, I'll be 60 this year. And I'm not worried about my 401k, which isn't really strong. I'm not worried about it. We're going to run to the finish line. That's what we're going to do.
Sure.
And I had a health scare here this last month or so ago, and it was a weird little event. It should have been a simple procedure. It turned out that, I had a very dire circumstance. I could have lost my life. They saved my life in the hospital. It was amazing. Okay, that could have been the end, but it wasn't the end. The Lord saw fit that I got time still ahead of me. Well, I say all that to say, for me personally, you asked me the question. It just reinforces to me, man, the time is now. When the Lord's ready to take me, the Lord will take me. If he's not ready to take me, he's not going to take me. And nothing else really matters. All that really matters is just to get the gospel out to the nations however we can. We may need to adjust, and this is going to be part of my new job description, to prayerfully consider, at least in the First Baptist Church context, how can we be as strategic as possible to help the gospel get around the world if we can't do it in a traditional missionary way, for example?
Sure.
Maybe in a vocational way, maybe in other ways. That might be an interesting podcast for you.
Yeah.
But this is the kind of thing. But there's no question. I've never. Oh, I was going to say this, and I'll finish. I actually believe that this whole deal with COVID in 2020 and now into 2021, I think it's the grace of God. I think God's being very gracious to all of us, giving us what I will consider one last chance. We've all been warned. We've all read about prophecy. We all know. So if you're lost, the Lord's given you one last chance to get saved.
Yeah.
If you're saved and you've been kind of a deadbeat Christian, the Lord's given you one last chance to finish strong, even though you've wasted a bunch of your years. And if you've been a faithful Christian, well, don't cave now because you're almost to the finish line.
Amen.
And so the Lord's like, man, stock up the rewards, go for it while you can. It's not going to be easy, but man, read about the rewards to the overcomer in Laodicea, and you'll be glad if you became one of those.
Yeah.
So I believe we're at the end, and I think we should run.
Yeah, I think that's a really good perspective to have, Jeff. Thank you for that. I couldn't agree more. For me, it's just been about, even the perspective I had, maybe not perspective, but just the goals I had when we would arrive on the field before COVID, have just shifted. Maybe I am praying. It would be really cool to see a giant revival in Hungary. But just given what I believe about the Bible, like you said, and what we're seeing in the world today, I'm kind of just praying for the gleanings. You know what I mean? It's like I don't know. I actually don't know if I will become fluent in this language before the Lord comes back. So what can I do?
Sure.
It kind of leads to, okay, what is your theology about the end times in the Bible? How does that affect your practice? And so that's really good. Thanks, man. I appreciate
the whole
everything you said.
Occupy till I come. You can do that. Just do whatever you can until that day. That's out of your control. Absolutely.
Yeah. Awesome. Thanks, man.
Awesome.
It's been great.
Yeah. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Well, there you go. Another episode with Pastor Jeff Bartell. Always great getting to talk to him. Of course, he's my pastor and mentor over the years, but it's always great just to hear from experienced missionaries and pastors, their perspective on different things, and just even being able to learn from their story and what they came through and how they went about doing things. And so it was very interesting just to hear about how things were culturally and even spiritually when he landed on the field in Albania. So I hope you guys learned something, especially there at the end where Jeff was urging us all to have a sense of urgency to, one, if you're not saved, to get saved while there's still time, but two, if you haven't been doing what God wants you to do, there's only so much time left, and God, it does seem God is being gracious and kind of letting us know, hey, there's not much time left. We need to be about our Father's business, y'all. We need to be doing what we're supposed to be doing. So make sure you're doing that. Be involved in global evangelism in the Great Commission, and let's see if we can bring in the gleanings before the Lord comes and calls the church home. Thank you guys so much for listening this week. I hope to see you back here next week, same time, same place. We'll have another guest on here talking about the Great Commission. Thank you guys so much. We'll see you next time. God bless.
Thanks for listening. Please rate and subscribe and share us on social media. Also, please make sure to check out our other podcast, Theology Roundtable, at theologyroundtable.com.